Good evening, and thank you so much for joining me tonight for the California Legislative Wrap-Up, a Roundup for 2015. My name is Duncan, and I am the California Director of Americans for Safe Access, the nation's leading medical cannabis patients advocacy organization. And tonight we're going to be talking about what happened in the California Legislature this year in 2015. It was a very unusual year in the state legislature. 14 bills that touched on some aspect of medical cannabis. And it was also a very unusual year in that a lot of things went right for us this year. We've been struggling in California for many years now to adopt commercial regulations for medical cannabis activity and also to protect patients' rights in the state of California. And on the balance, we had a really good year this year. And so I want to start off by saying that while we're going to talk tonight about things that went well, things that went badly, and what comes next, I drive home to everyone the fact that medical cannabis patients did well in Sacramento this year. And so I'm going to start off talking tonight about some of the less controversial measures that were before the state legislature, because I know a lot of folks are still just logging in, and it takes a little bit if you're new to Google Plus and Google Chrome to get signed up. And so I know a lot of you are logging in tonight and joining this broadcast because you want to know about the regulatory bills. And we're going to get to that in just a minute. And about halfway through this broadcast, in about 20 or 25 minutes or so, we're going to have a time. I'm going to leave a long time with a lot of comments, and I want to make sure you have plenty of time to participate and be a part of this as well. And if you don't have a lot of comments, we'll have a shorter broadcast tonight. So thanks again for joining, and let me jump right in with what is my favorite bill of the year, one that passed earlier in the legislative session. It's a piece of legislation sponsored by Americans for Safe Access called the Medical Cannabis Organ Transplant Act. If you follow our emails and our blog posts and our Facebook and all of that, of course, you know all about this bill. Most people in California don't realize that medical cannabis patients are routinely denied an organ transplant if they test positive for legal medical cannabis use. And there's nothing in our state law that actually prevents that from happening. We adopted this mission of passing a law to protect those patients because one of our members died. And after Mr. Norman died in illegal medical cannabis use, we started to hear from others. And we found other cases where people were facing a terrible choice, recommended medicine, or not receiving a life-saving tragedies. We've heard from 3 or 4 people around the state who had loved ones who died as a result of this. And so we set about at Americans for Safe Access to correct that problem. It took us 2 years to do it. Legislative work is slow, and we talked to lawmakers, we talked to staff members, we talked to the California Medical Association, and I'm just so proud that this year, finally, AB 258, the Medical Cannabis Organ Transplant Act by Assemblymember Mark Levine, he's a Democrat from Marin, was finally adopted by the state legislature and signed by the governor, and that becomes the law of the land, like virtually all legislation, on January 1st of next year. And so starting on January 1st, medical cannabis patients who need an organ transplant cannot be denied that transplant just because they use legal doctor-recommended medical cannabis. And I'm really proud of that. I have personal friends who are impacted by that terrible choice and who are at risk. And I know this law is going to prevent tragedies. Now, we're not finished. If you've been following what I'm saying online and on Facebook and on our blog, you know that there's still work to be done on the organ transplant issue. Patients today are still being denied. I just heard a few days ago from a patient in San Diego who had been denied an organ transplant for using medical cannabis. And that is not the intent of the law, and that's not going to stand when this law takes effect. We're going to do a public education campaign for doctors, for transplant centers, for patients, and where it's necessary, we're going to fight back and make sure that these patients get their equal access to health care to which they're entitled under California law. So I really hope everyone is just as proud as I am about the huge strides forward that we've made with organ transplants, and it sets the stage for something really exciting next year. We'll get to that at the end of the broadcast today. But that was a huge victory, and I hope it didn't get lost in all of the drama and controversy about the rest of the issue. The other issue that was really at the forefront of legislative activity right now was cultivation of medical cannabis. And frankly, we had a little bit of a mixed bag here. The regulatory bills that we'll talk about in just a minute dealt with cultivation, but there was a bad bill that snuck through. It was SB 165. SB 165 is by Senator Monning, and Senator Monning's bill increased penalties, civil penalties, for cultivating cannabis on public and on private land, and it really did not draw a very clear distinction between medical cannabis that's legal under state law and non-medical cannabis that is not yet legal under state law. And so this bill, I think, is really going to be a problem for folks because they're not going to know about increased penalties. They wind up crossways with law enforcement for some reason, prosecuted for a cultivation-related crime, and all of a sudden, they're going to find these increased penalties for cultivating medical cannabis, and that's really not fair. And so that bill is easily through the state legislature this year, even though Americans for Safe Access and others did oppose the bill. We also saw a lot of activity this year around Hello, I hope some of you are still around. My apologies, we've had some technical difficulties that resulted in, I think most of you probably just dropped the broadcast just then, but looks like we're back up and running, so my apologies. And if you're still with me, I'm gonna pick up where I left off. We were talking about concentrates of cannabis, and that I'm very glad to see that Americans for Safe Access helped defeat one bill that would have increased penalties for manufacturing concentrated cannabis, but two others did make it through the legislative process. SB 212 by Senator Mendoza will increase penalties for manufacturing concentrated cannabis within 200 feet of an occupied structure, a relatively arbitrary and again a penalty-based approach to manufacturing concentrated cannabis. And then a bill by lawmakers generally on our side, AB 849 by Assemblymember Bonilla, which actually makes it a crime to manufacture concentrated cannabis if you cause an explosion. That actually fills a gap in California law. If you're manufacturing concentrated cannabis and cause a fire, that's a crime in California, but causing an explosion that doesn't start a fire is not a crime. And so that Bonilla bill now makes it a crime to cause an explosion, even if you don't set the house or the structure that you're in on fire. So I don't think those are really great ways to go about regulating concentrated cannabis, but that is an easy solution for lawmakers to latch onto. I also want to call your attention to a bill that did not go to a vote this year, Assemblymember Gibson's 821, AB 821, which would have exempt terminally ill patients from sales tax in the state of California. That bill will come for a vote next year. And also AJR 25, which is a resolution calling on Congress and the US Congress to allow marijuana and medical cannabis and cannabis businesses access to banking services. That will also come to a vote this year. And then finally, before we get to the meat of it with the regulatory bills, there is SB 443 by Senator Mitchell, which would have reformed California's broken asset forfeiture laws. Right now in the state of California, law enforcement can confiscate your property even if you're not convicted of a crime. And that is just fundamentally unfair and un-American. And that bill would have corrected that problem. Unfortunately, it died at the last minute in the state legislature. And so we have to come back next year and try to jump on this national bandwagon of reforming civil asset forfeiture laws. So there was a lot going on this year. There were 14 bills. I haven't touched on all of them, but I think what a lot of folks have been primarily concerned about this year are commercial regulations for medical cannabis. And that's something that Americans for Safe Access has been working on all the way back for 3 years. We worked with Tom Amiano on his regulatory bill, which did not make it through the state legislature. We worked last year both with Assemblymember Amiano and with Senator Correa to pass a bill. And this year we were back, and we were really surprised this year to see a change in the temperament of the legislature, where many people now seemed eager to jump in and regulate medical cannabis. Assemblymember Jones Sawyer introduced AB 26. Assemblymember Cooley introduced AB 34. We had Assemblymember Bonta with AB 266. We had Senator McGuire with SB 643. We had Assemblymember Wood with AB 243. And so there were many, many efforts to regulate medical cannabis. And the reason that this is happening, that this happened this year, is because there's an urgency in the state legislature to finally get something done. Frankly, lawmakers and leadership, I think, were embarrassed that they had gone so long without actually passing a regulatory bill. It's been 18 years since medical cannabis was legalized in the state of California. And so I think they were really ready to do it, but they're also worried about legalization. And they wanted to make sure that they had a medical cannabis bill on the table and in effect before a vote in 2016 about the legalization of cannabis for adult use. And so there were many factors pushing that process forward. Perhaps most significantly was a sea change that happened last year in California politics that went largely unnoticed in the media, but was really important. You see, up until last year, some of the most powerful lobbyist organizations in the state of California have maintained a stance of opposing all things cannabis. The California Narcotics Officers Association, the California Police Chiefs Association, and the California League of Cities, which most voters don't even know about, but is a very powerful lobbyist organization that represents the interest of cities in the state legislature. And these lobbyist organizations realized with the Amiano bill 3 years ago that the tide was turning and they were losing control of the situation with medical cannabis, and sooner or later it would be legalized. And they realized that if they did not come to the table and start supporting regulations and having a voice in that we were going to come along and regulate medical cannabis on our terms. And so while it's a mixed blessing, because obviously have a very different perspective and very different values and motives than we do on medical cannabis, there was really a breaking of a log jam last year when these powerful lobbyist organizations for cities and for law enforcement finally dropped years of opposition to all things medical cannabis and came to the table. The bill last year was a problematic one. It was one that might have been workable, but it was SB 1262, and I know a lot of people had strong reservations about it. But this year, we actually came back with some better proposals, and we saw these bills very early in the legislative cycle start to merge. We saw AB 26 and AB 34 were sort of absorbed into AB 266, and what we ultimately had were parallel processes happening in the Assembly and the Senate to regulate medical cannabis. This process went on through the entire legislative process, and I'm really proud to say that we saw some big improvements in these bills, and I can see ASA's fingerprints on those improvements. And I'm really happy to say that patients did well in the legislative process. We were able to get the regulatory oversight out of the Alcoholic Beverage Commission, which is a huge step forward because we do not want medicine in California regulated like a vice, like alcohol or tobacco. And so we got it out of there. We stopped a statewide excise tax on virtually all cannabis cultivation. We achieved a tiered licensing program so that medical cannabis businesses will be able now to participate in licensing at different levels depending on the size of the business. So we've made a safe space for some of the smaller players in the industry. We've also, and I think most importantly, maintained a safe place for patients and caregivers for personal cultivation. If you're growing for your own personal medical need in the state of California, you do not have to get a license or abide by the regulations that apply to the commercial growers. And so we really did come a long, long way this year. And so we're going to talk about the details of what passed, but before we get to that, I want to talk about the process, because frankly, it was confusing and maybe a little bit frustrating. You know, these two bills, AB 266 in the State Assembly and SB 643 in the Senate, we're moving on parallel courses, but there was some resistance, bureaucratic resistance and political resistance to getting these bills together. And all along this year, I've been telling lawmakers that the best strategy was what I call the Lord of the Rings strategy, one bill to rule them all. And we really needed one bill moving forward. And we did get there, but we didn't get there until Friday night, late in the session. That was the last day of the session. And it was a very frustrating experience to be waiting by the computer, waiting by the phone for news about what the final language would be. And overall, I was happy with what we saw in the merged bills. The merged bills are called the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act. And three bills comprise this act. So there are three different bills. It's AB 266, SB 643, and another bill from the Assembly, AB 243. They've all merged together into one giant piece of legislation. And it's very similar to the kind of regulations you see in other states. And like all of the processes that are perhaps a little bit less accessible, this one, definitely left a lot to be desired, and there were some zingers in there at the last minute we didn't like. But the first thing you need to know about this giant bill is that it's not going to change things right away in the state of California. The bill takes effect on January 1st, but the rulemaking process for the various agencies, there's a bureau in the Department of Consumer Affairs, also in the Department of Health and the Department of Food and Agriculture. All of these organizations of these departments are charged with writing regulations that touch on their respective aspects of medical cannabis. And so this is going to take a long, long time. We are probably looking at an effective date that is a year, or a licensing date that is a year or more in the future. And so if you are legally organized and operate a medical cannabis business right now in the state of California, you actually have a long time to keep operating before these rules take effect, and you do not have to change your operational status until your application for a license under state regulations is actually approved or denied. And so the agencies that will be regulating folks under the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act are the Bureau of Medical Marijuana Regulation, which is going to be a part of the Department of Consumer Affairs, which, by the way, is where ASA has always advocated that regulation of medical cannabis should be in the state of California. And that bureau will have an advisory committee and a chairman appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate. And they're the ones who are supposed to oversee the overall licensing of medical cannabis in California. The Department of Food and Agriculture will regulate cultivation, and the Department of Health will develop standards for manufacturing, testing, production, labeling, edibles, and the other details that would normally fall under the purview of health and safety for the public. There's also going to be a pesticide regulation body that's created within the Department of Fish and Wildlife, and other environmental standards created by Fish and Wildlife too. So a lot of agencies are involved. It's a lot of moving pieces. But what's good about this is that we're seeing agencies that have a germane mission to enforce medical cannabis. So we're not seeing, for instance, ABC trying to enforce health standards. We're not seeing the Department of Food and Agriculture trying to figure out, how to deal with sales tax. The right agencies now are plugged in, and even though it's complicated, I think it's really a good model to move forward with in the state of California. The licenses for commercial medical cannabis are complicated, and I want to urge you to look at the links to the various documents I posted on the Google side and on YouTube and on Facebook to find the text of the bills. It's long. You're going to be looking at over 100 pages of documents, but there are multiple licenses. There are over a dozen types of licenses for cultivation, manufacturing products, distribution, dispensaries, and testing, transportation, all of these different kinds of licenses, and in different sizes for different size players. And the idea that of the framers of the bill is that they would break up the industry into constituent parts so that no one part of the industry would ever dominate it and have too much influence over the marketplace or over the economics of medical cannabis. And while that's a worthwhile strategy, it certainly does make this bill complicated, and it will deny some people the economy of scale and efficiency that goes with vertical integration. We did score some victories in this fight about vertical integration because there is a limited degree that's allowed. People can hold any 2 licenses, barring some technicalities in the details of the bill. But what the state does not want is they don't want one person controlling every aspect of cultivation, distribution, testing, manufacturing, and so forth. And so they've broken that up and inserted a brand new industry into medical cannabis in California. It's called a distributor. Now, a distributor is not a dispensary. It's a kind of business that will receive cannabis from the cultivator and then transmit it to the manufacturer. Now, they don't have to buy the cannabis. The purpose of the distributor is to weigh, measure, test for quality and contaminants, but most importantly for the state, to tax medical cannabis. And so all of medical cannabis in California will now be going through a distributor the same way that tobacco and alcohol have to go through distributors to be provided in the state of California as well. There are limits on the size of cultivation under the bill. They're limiting cultivation licenses to a maximum of 1 acre. That's 43,560 square feet, by the way, for outdoor cultivation. That's a lot of cultivation for an individual operator. So that's not too terrible. They're limiting indoor cultivation to 22,000 square feet for large operations, based on the assumption, of course, that an indoor garden will produce more harvest per year. Therefore, it shouldn't be as large as an outdoor garden. I'm not a big fan of these sort of numeric limits on cultivation. I don't think it's a very scientific or practical way to do it, but that is what lawmakers came up with. They're also allowing in this complicated licensing scheme that any organization that is already vertically integrated because their city or the county allows that or requires it, they can stay vertically integrated. And so if you're in a city, say a city like Palm Springs one of the others that already requires you to be vertically integrated, you can stay that way. So that's actually a good step. You can stay that way until 2026. So that's a long time to stay vertically integrated, and we have a long, long time in that regard to come back and fix that law and deal with it if we need to. It may turn out that this model works just fine and we don't have to. So we've got the lack of vertical integration to a certain extent. We improved that a little bit, but not a lot. We've got the distributors. We also have an issue that's been very controversial in California that's we refer to as local control. And what this means is that the state licensing is contingent upon a local license. And that's very controversial because some cities and counties have banned medical marijuana dispensaries and even cultivation. And this bill is requiring that you obtain that local license before you can get the state license. That is not something that we want to see in regulations, but it's something we're stuck with. There was not even one lawmaker who was willing to push back on the issue of local control, of cities and counties being able to decide whether marijuana businesses are actually located within their borders. What that means is that some cities and counties in California are stuck. They're going to be stuck with bans, and we're going to have to keep working on that both at the local and state level. But many cities and counties will license commercial medical cannabis activity now that they have guidance from the state about what's legal. And so I believe at the end of the day, we'll have more local regulations for medical cannabis and not fewer. But I am also happy to report that we got two big concessions in this local control issue. And one is the word authorize. The bill says that your city or your county must license, permit, or authorize medical cannabis activity. And so that word authorize leaves us a little leeway for cities and counties that don't issue permits or licenses, but don't necessarily want to oppose this kind of local regulation. And so there may be some middle ground there for cities and counties to sort of take the middle road and not commit, but not prevent licensing within their jurisdiction. I'm also happy to report that in a suggestion that ASA and many others had made to lawmakers, they have agreed that if a city or county chooses to do nothing about medical cannabis, by March 1st of 2016, they don't ban it, they don't regulate it, they just do nothing, which is their right, then the state will take over as the sole licensing authority under AB 266 and the Medical Marijuana Safety and Regulation Act, which means that if cities opt to do nothing, the state can license operators within those jurisdictions. That's a really big step forward because it doesn't force cities and counties to do something they don't want to, but at the same time, it allows the state to move ahead with licensing. And so I think that's a really huge step forward for the state of California, is that cities can simply be silent, and that doesn't block access. It actually facilitates access. The same principle, by the way, applies to deliveries, which are authorized, an authorized licensing activity under this bill. Dispensaries can deliver medicine, and cities and counties don't have to approve of that in advance. You can just go ahead and deliver that medicine into any city unless the city specifically bans delivery within their jurisdiction. Now, obviously, we'd like to see no bans on delivery, but if we're stuck with that, that's the better way to do it than to ban deliveries up front and then require the cities to authorize deliveries as opposed to requiring the cities to ban them. So that also is a big step forward for us. The bills create a tracking program for medical cannabis. Plants will be tagged and have an individual unique identifying number that would then, of course, make up a batch and lots that move through the process. So there can be tracking. This helps ensure there's no diversion and no cross-contamination with the illicit market. Similar programs have been working already in Mendocino County and in Colorado. And so while that's going to be a huge logistical undertaking for the state of California, it's definitely something that's already been done and tried before. For the first time in California now, we will see the advent of for-profit medical cannabis businesses. And I say for-profit for real, structured as for-profits, as opposed to businesses that are nominally nonprofits but actually operate in a for-profit manner. And so I think that's actually a big step forward for California to acknowledge how medical cannabis is working for real and to work in that venue instead of pretending that they are nonprofit corporations in California that are selling cannabis and not actually turning a profit. This bill has a testing provision, which I think is great for patient safety. The bill allows and indeed requires that cannabis be tested before it enters the commercial marketplace. And it also allows individual patients who are cultivating their own medicine to take their medicine to commercial testing laboratories and have their medicine tested too. So whether you get your medicine from a licensed dispensary or you grow it yourself, which is allowed under the bill, you'll still be able to test it. The bill maintains privacy for all patient information, which is really important, so that your personal information as a patient, if you choose to engage the commercial marketplace, will never be publicly distributed. And one of the things the bill does that is, again, a two-edged sword is it deletes a portion of the Medical Marijuana Program Act, better known as SB 420. The Medical Marijuana Program Act was a bill passed in 2003 by the state legislature, and that bill had many, many components to it, but most importantly, it recognized the cooperative and collective model for cultivating and providing cannabis. And that has served the state pretty well, but it's not something explicitly articulated under the law. It's sort of implied by the law. And what the commercial licensing is going to let us do is have absolute clear protection for people in the industry, for the patients and the caregivers in the industry. They won't have to explain and try to sort of fill in the blanks under this cooperative and collective model, which has always been very vague. Now they're going to have state licenses, and they'll be immune from prosecution so long as they're obeying the regulations adopted in the coming years by these state licensing bureaus. And so even though we are very nostalgic, I think, for the collective and cooperative model, and it has served us well, we are definitely at a turning point in California where it's time to move on with commercial regulations. And then finally, and I realize that there's a lot to go through here, but I also want to mention doctors and doctors who write recommendations. Of all the things I've heard misinformation about this bill, it's about the doctors. And the fact is that this Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act does virtually nothing to doctors. It changes almost nothing for doctors who recommend medical cannabis. There's not a limit on how many recommendations you can give. There's no state registry for doctors who write recommendations. No doctors are going to go to jail for writing recommendations. It just doesn't do that. What it says is that it will be unprofessional conduct for a doctor in the state of California to excessively recommend medical cannabis without a good faith prior exam, which is the exact same standard that exists for every other controlled substance in the state of California and arguably exists for cannabis already. And so we're not really changing much, but what we're also doing is we're putting that burden on the California Medical Board, which has been very reluctant to prosecute doctors for medical cannabis crimes anyway. And so I'm not terribly worried about a rash of prosecutions of doctors, because the medical board simply doesn't do that much. And so saying to the medical board this should be a higher priority, I don't really see that we're going to have a big problem with that. The bill does prohibit doctors from taking kickbacks from dispensaries, which is very good, because you don't want your doctor having the financial interest, his own financial interest or her own financial interest ahead of your welfare when he or she is writing a recommendation. So there is a provision in there that creates a misdemeanor for having a financial interest in a dispensary or receiving remuneration from a dispensary. There's also a really confusing phrase, which as people are sincerely confused about, and that is attending physician. The bill says that your medical marijuana recommendation must come from your attending physician. That's already the law in the state of California. In the Medical Marijuana Program Act, the attending physician is defined already in that act. And so it is not your primary care physician. That's a big point of contention for people, is that they think they have to go to their normal doctor through their HMO or their insurance or their family doctor to get a recommendation, and if that person won't give it to them, maybe they're stuck. Well, that's not the case. You do not have to see your primary care physician. You have to see an attending physician, and an attending physician is simply defined as a doctor who has examined you or your medical records and given you a good faith recommendation for an actual medical condition. And that's not too much to ask. And if a doctor can't meet even that minimal standard, then perhaps that doctor is not providing the best care for their patient. And so it's not a huge hurdle. And arguably, again, it's already the standard established under the Medical Marijuana Program Act under SB 420. So I'm not terribly concerned that we're going to run out of recommendations in the state of California. And I think if this bill prompts doctors to provide a little bit more health care to the patients to whom they write recommendations, that's great as far as I'm concerned. Finally, I want to talk about fees and taxes, and then I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions. All of this is to be paid for by fees from licensees. There was an excise tax. ASA lobbied hard to get rid of that. I'm really happy to see it's not in the final bill. And so commercial operators who want licenses will pay fees on a sliding scale based on their size in order to pay for this. So the general fund in California will advance to the medical marijuana program, to the Bureau, $10 million. and then they will recoup that money through the licensing fees. And so they'll have money to operate, they'll collect fees, and that's going to pay for the program. And so this money does not come from taxes on patients and taxes on medicine. It comes from fees for services. And in California, the Constitution requires that fees be reasonably related to the service provided by the state. And so we're not going to see here what we've seen in some other states where there are huge arbitrary fees just tacked on to medical cannabis. The Bureau will be able to assess fees for the actual services it provides to licensees and to applicants, and for nothing else. And so that's a win for industry, and something that's going to help keep costs down for patients in the long term. There is also a provision in the bill that allows counties to tax medical cannabis activity. And I don't like that. You know, ASA has always opposed taxation of medical cannabis, even though we've had to recognize over the years that it's a necessary evil in many respects. And this bill has a little prize in it for the counties. The counties want to be able to tax, and so this bill authorizes them to tax. But we have to keep in mind what that means is that counties already have the legal authority to tax activity that happens within their borders. And so all this bill is doing is reaffirming the status quo, really, that cities and counties already have the right to tax medical cannabis. And so we're not really giving them anything they couldn't do already, although frankly, I wish it wasn't in the bill. But on the whole, when I look at this bill with all of those provisions, and again, I hope you'll look it up because it's over 100 pages of text to look at, I think this is a win for patients because we are finally going to have a regulated, licensed system. It's going to be very clear for law enforcement what's legal. It will be clear to cities and counties that need to authorize activity locally what's legal. It'll be clear for patients who's legal and who's not. And I think we're on the right path. And I want to let you know that this is working in other states. And so I know there's a lot of concern about regulation, but I do believe that our industry in California has been resilient, it's adaptive, we've overcome much bigger hurdles. I remember there was a time in history when we were seeing one DEA raid in California every week. And so we've overcome big hurdles before. And I believe we're on a path to stopping that. We're going to stop local prosecutions, state prosecutions, and there's even a possibility that if the Department of Justice sticks to their current policy, that we're going to stop federal prosecutions and move ahead to make this a genuine, bona fide healthcare industry in the state of California. And so where there are trade-offs when it comes to local control or taxation or additional hurdles to jump over for licensing, I think it's a fair trade-off for the benefits, the proven benefits of regulation, because we've seen in California at the city and county level and around the country with regulations, that sensible regulations like what we see in the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act preserve access for patients, they reduce crime, they reduce complaints, and that's a win-win for every stakeholder in the state of California. So I don't want people to think that it's a terrible development that we have licensing and regulation now. It's a necessary step that's taking us to complete 100% legitimacy in the state of California. Now, I know many people have opinions about this and comments and questions. I'm actually hoping you guys are still there. I don't know if the feed worked. We had that technical difficulty before. So if you have questions and comments and you want to start typing those in now, this would be a great time. And I want to say thank you to Talana out in Washington, D.C., who's helping us with this process. And she's going to be taking your questions and sending those over to me. In terms of the legislative process, I want to let you know that this process is not finished. The bill was passed at the 11th hour. I don't even think, frankly, most lawmakers read the final version, but it's on the books. But most of this we won't be dealing with until 2018. And so there's still time to go back next year and participate in the rulemaking process, which is where a lot of the details are going to happen outside the political limelight. There's time to pass new legislation, and there's still no telling what's going to happen in November of 2016 with legalization for adult use. And so that initiative may even address some of the concerns, the shortcomings, and the unintended consequences of medical cannabis regulation. So there are still many pieces in play, even though we have taken a really important first step. So I see a question rolling up here on the screen, and don't type too fast, by the way. I've only got a little space for your questions on my screen. It says, I'm concerned about the other classes of licenses and the lack of licensing that currently exists for them in local entities. Distributors, transporters, manufacturers, and other categories didn't exist until just now, so there are no local zoning for them. How will this work if cities and counties don't think of including these in their municipal codes and only address licensing for dispensaries and cultivation? That's a very, very good question. And indeed, that's correct. The person is correct. Cities and counties don't license this activity right now, but they are looking at this right now. There are cities and counties all over the state. Now, honestly, mostly in Northern California, where they're more tolerant of medical cannabis, they're looking at distributors and processors and what have you. And, of course, vertically integrated cities and counties, these activities will already be possible. And so cities and counties have until March 1st of 2016 to adopt an ordinance, but that is not the final deadline. That means that after March 1st of 2016, the state can begin the regulatory process and licensing process, and cities and counties can jump on board at any time. And so, because the existing operators can continue to operate until 2018, we still have time for cities and counties to figure out these new licensing. And I suspect what you're going to see is cities and counties taking the list of a dozen or so licensing levels and, frankly, just authorizing those all over the state. I think you're going to see an explosion of cities and counties who want to do this not just for humanitarian purposes, but also, frankly, for revenue purposes. So I'm not too concerned we're going to totally run out of licenses, frankly. I think you're going to see a golden era of local licensing that's coming up under this legislation. The timing, by the way, is complicated. The collective and cooperative defense does not go away until 1 year after the regulations are in place, and anyone who is currently operating, legally organized and operating under local law, can stay open and continue operating until they have their license approved or denied by the state regulators. So I think there's enough leeway to help us get through the transitional period. So I hope that answered that question. I left off a little part at the end, I think. So other questions and comments, please feel free to type those in. And I see we're moving towards the end. My apologies again for the technical problems at the beginning, but I want to talk while we wait for any additional comments or questions a little bit about what's coming next, what's on the horizon, because we're not finished with medical cannabis. And one of the things that we're going to deal with is clean up legislation to correct some of the problems, maybe deal with local control, licensing, taxation, some of these things we're not really happy about with the bill so far. So that may be back on the table. And in fact, as soon as Thursday of this week, I'm going to be back in legislative offices in Sacramento talking about what we need to do next year to clean up this legislation. So that's definitely on the table. There's going to be a rulemaking process where instead of debating things on the floor of the Assembly and the Senate, we go and get to sit down with bureaucrats and talk to them about what rules look like. And we have really strong models, I think, with the American Herbal Products Association recommendation for regulators that can help guide that conversation. So I'm feeling really good about the rulemaking process. But there's other stuff that we're going to deal with next year that I am frankly more excited about, because the Organ Transplant Act is really, for me, really ignited an enthusiasm for patients' rights. You know, for many years we've been preoccupied, and rightly so, with commercial regulations. But I really feel like it's time for the state of California to turn its attention back to the unfinished business of Proposition 215. And part of that unfinished business are the civil rights of patients. We've protected patients who need organ transplants, but we have not yet protected patients from discrimination in employment, in housing, in parental rights, and in access to other health care. And I'm getting just a ton of calls and emails from patients right now who are being denied opiate medicines because they use medical cannabis. And that's really just a shame, because patients who use medical cannabis use fewer opiate medicines, they have fewer overdoses and better outcomes. And so we really need to tackle that. And so we don't know next year if we're going to bring a comprehensive civil rights bill for medical cannabis patients, or if we're going to break this up into individual parts and try to bring several bills. But we're going to be back next year, after the era of commercial regulations, really fighting for patients' rights to make sure that discrimination that happens outside of the criminal justice system can be addressed here in California. And I'm really excited about doing that. I really saw a lot of eyes open in the state legislature about organ transplants this year, and I think it's really, really important that we finish that work. It's perfectly fine to create an industry, but you cannot create that industry and ignore the rights of the people who for whom that industry was created and which it serves. And so it's really important we do that. I see another question rolled up here on the screen. It says, can topical cannabis be sold anywhere to anyone whoops, it just rolled off. Anywhere to anyone if it's not considered a drug. And you know, honestly, I'm not sure I can answer that question. I would say if a topical contains cannabis or components of cannabis, it would probably be subject to the commercial regulations that have been adopted by the state. And so it would probably have to be grown at a licensed cultivation site, produced by a licensed manufacturer, and sold to a licensed distributor. But that particular question, frankly, hasn't come up yet. So my working assumption is that no, it couldn't be, even though it's topical, it wouldn't be considered not a drug because it contains cannabis, which is still a controlled substance. That's ultimately something we're gonna have to solve. But for now, cannabis remains a controlled substance under both state and federal law. Another message popped up. It said, did they think to exclude cold water concentrates such as hash as far as concentrates go? And another really perceptive question, and the answer is kind of. The bill by Bonilla, AB 849, specifically focuses on concentrates of cannabis that use volatile solvents, whereas the sentencing bill that was adopted does not. It just says manufacturing of concentrated cannabis, even though it was intended to be a butane bill. And so it is hypothetically possible that if you're charged with a crime related to concentrating, to making concentrates of cannabis with cold water, you could get a sentence enhancement if, say, for instance, a minor, someone under the age of 16 was injured somehow in your cold water hash manufacturing, which seems silly, but I guess that could happen. Then theoretically, you could be charged with a sentence enhancement there because of that bill. And again, that's one of the downsides of these sort of silly penalty-based bills that don't really deter people from doing anything that's risky. And in fact, if you're manufacturing concentrates with butane or anything else, you don't even know that bill passed until you get charged with a crime. So it's really not an effective way to protect anybody. And I would have much rather seen all of that put off to the regulatory bodies, say in the Department of Food and Agriculture, than have that, you know, dealt with as simply a sentence enhancement. Also, of course, coming up on the horizon is legalization. In November of 2016, we are probably going to have a voter initiative, maybe more than one, to legalize cannabis for adult use. And it's going to be really important for us to be vigilant in creating the voter initiative and in campaigning for it about what patients need, because cannabis and medical cannabis are closely related issues, but they're not the same issue. And so we want to make sure we have a legalization model in California that works for both patients and for adult users. And so I think that the state of Colorado has done a passable job of that. They have dual systems, and one of the reasons they were able to have a dual system between medical and non-medical cannabis is because their medical recommendations were already on the books and up and running before legalization came along. When I look to Washington State, I see a state that did it much less elegantly. And what they tried to do was to cram the two systems together. And the fact is that patients have different needs than adult users. And we need to be very vigilant in next year about making sure that patients do not give up any ground in order to create a legal cannabis industry in the state of California, which is not to say that I oppose legalization. Obviously, legalization is going to keep people out of jails and it's going to address social justice issues. So it's very important, but we need to make sure that we don't give up ground, because things we saw rolled back in Washington and to a lesser extent in Oregon were things like personal cultivation, an increase in taxation, providers in the adult use facilities were barred from talking about the medical benefits of cannabis, which is very important for patients. We don't want to give up that ground. And while Proposition 215 cannot be amended by the state legislature, it is still very important that we don't let another voter initiative come along and through the process of unintended consequences erode the rights or the privileges of patients right now. And so I think there's an important role for medical cannabis patients to play in the upcoming legalization debate. And that's going to be a big part of what's happening next year as well. There were a couple of questions that were posted on the walls before the broadcast, and I'm actually flipping through my notes looking for them now. One was about taxation. I think we've addressed that issue. And so I also want to, too many notes. Here we go. So a question posted on one of the walls says, people are already talking about suing over the act. how does this work at the state level? And first of all, the Medical Marijuana Regulation and Safety Act is a lawful act of the state legislature, and under the principles of sovereign immunity, you can't sue the legislature just because you don't like what they did. And so in most people's interpretation, licensing and regulation is a normal function of government. However, there is one thing in there that's a potential vulnerability for a lawsuit, and I've already seen lawyers on the internet talking about lawsuits about patient cultivation. Now, we did preserve the right of an individual patient or a primary caregiver growing for 5 or fewer patients to cultivate their own medicine and not get a license or be regulated. But the bill says that it has to be 100 square feet or less. And that was never in the process that we discussed with lawmakers leading up to this bill. And so that's one of the downsides of the process, is that should have been debated publicly. I believe that provision violates a Supreme Court decision, People versus Kelly from 2010, that struck down numeric limits on possession and cultivation in SB 420. And so the same principle should apply to 100 square feet. If you can't limit the weight that patients can have, and you can't limit the number of plants a patient can cultivate, then by extension, you should not be able to limit square footage. And so I think lawmakers may have set themselves up here for a court challenge with this 100 square foot limit. And I would not at all be surprised to see somebody sue and win based on People versus Kelly. I see a new question just popped up on the screen. It says, so a city authorizing my delivery service is essentially agreeing in writing, question mark, not to shut me down for not having a license. How legally can my city authorize me? And the answer to that is we don't know. The bill says that your city must license, permit, or authorize you. And what an authorization looks like, I don't know, but I would almost be certain that it has to be in writing, because you're gonna have to prove it somehow. And so I don't think it's gonna be enough for the mayor to be like, yeah, you guys are okay, you know, you can operate. I think you're gonna have to get something in writing, but it may be something short of a license or permit. And the truth is, we're actually not gonna know how that pans out until cities and counties act. And so you do need, everyone who's in the business of medical cannabis needs to be getting into their city councils and their boards of supervisors right now and getting temporary legislation or something adopted to license, permit, or authorize. And I don't know how generous the state licensing body is going to be with that word authorized, but we're going to be pushing them to be very, very, very generous. We may run just a little bit over tonight. We usually end these broadcasts at 9, but we had that little 10-minute disruption in the middle, so I want to make sure I get as many of your questions as possible. Here's a new one. It says, so if the local counties and cities have banned dispensaries and outdoor grows like Redding, Shasta County, I'm asking so we can try to get them to agree to allow to operate in these places. And if they decide to do nothing and let the state license, then are you able to operate in those cities and counties? So if your city and county has a ban, then the state will not license a medical marijuana business in that city or county if there's an outright ban. The state only takes over in situations where cities and counties choose to do nothing. If they take no action, then the state takes over as the sole licensing authority. One of the sad realities in California right now is that the California Supreme Court has held that nothing in state law prevents a city or county from banning. And there's a case right now about cultivation isn't decided. We're hoping for the best in that case, but they may also soon decide that cities and counties can ban cultivation on a statewide level. And we're kind of stuck with that right now. It's a battle that the medical cannabis movement fought and lost. And we're stuck right now. I do believe some cities and counties that have been ambivalent will be persuaded by state licensing, but it's going to require some local work. You know, as they say, all politics is local, and cities and counties are going to have to hear from people in that jurisdiction about overturning bans, or voters are going to have to get together and overturn them. And I do believe that there are going to be some places in the state of California that continue to be what I call access deserts, and that's places where there simply is no practical or legal or regulated access to medical cannabis, because the people in those communities are very conservative on the issue of cannabis, and they just don't want to approve a voter initiative to allow for access. So if you get a law or you have no law, I think there's a path forward. If your city or county bans, I think you're in a very difficult position, and there's really not a path forward with state legislation right now to address that issue. Another question just rolled up on the screen here. It says, what about people who have past convictions with cannabis? How will it affect these people? The language on that is complicated and confusing, but the overly simplified answer to that is that if you have a cannabis conviction, you can still receive a license from the state. If you have a felony conviction for other kinds of drug trafficking, the Bureau has the discretion to issue a license if you can explain why you have this felony conviction, but I think that's going to be a huge hurdle. And so if you have a conviction in California for something that is not cannabis related, you're probably going to have a hard time getting a license. Now the Bureau does have the discretion here to evaluate your circumstances. You can also get what's called a certificate of rehabilitation, which is a court process that can be long and expensive, but you can do that. And if your records are expunged or you have a certificate of rehabilitation, then of course you can get a license. But there is going to be a barrier for some people who have felony convictions, but we did carve out an exception, a concession for people who got felony convictions for cannabis crimes, because obviously a lot of people in the business of medical cannabis have been convicted of crimes just for doing what's right and trying to be legal in the state of California. So there's a pathway forward, but it is a narrow one. That's the same question that popped up again. Another one that I saw earlier, the question of, well, the second question said, do you think such suits will be legal? I think referring again to the 100 square foot thing, and the answer is yes. I think those suits will be successful. And if that is overturned in the courts, it doesn't overturn the whole bill. It just overturns the portion of the bill that deals with the 100 square foot issue. One other detailed question, and we'll be wrapping up pretty soon. It says, some categories of licenses did allow for 2 licenses. Well, the next 3 questions here are all about the various categories of licensing, and the entire purpose of this licensing, of dividing it up and saying you can have 1 cultivation and 1 dispensary but not a distributor, is to keep the industry small. And that has pluses and minuses. Obviously in business, there's economy of scale that's passed on to consumers. But I think lawmakers ultimately did not want to create a big business in cannabis, and they didn't want any one player to control too much of the industry. And so that's what all of these licensing divisions are about. The specifics of them, for instance, 1 license type can have 3 dispensaries, and a specialty cultivator can be a dispensary but not a large-scale cultivator. These are political compromises and decisions that were made by staff members in the state legislature. And you know, this may be something we have to keep revisiting, frankly, because I don't know if all of these licensing categories are going to work. And I guess we're going to see as it unfolds if we need different ones or fewer ones or what have you. So here's another question that rolled up. And if you have a question or comment, by the way, I want to call on you to get it on the screen now, because we're going to wrap up soon. We're after 9. This one says, is there any initiative or plans for ASA to help members in cities and counties get their bans repealed, get authorizations? Is it going to require much more grassroots effort than the state campaigns, et cetera, et cetera? And yes, as a matter of fact, we very much want to do that. And we're going to be publishing a brand new model ordinance for cities and counties based on this new law. That will probably be out sometime after the 1st of the year, but hopefully sooner. But these things take a long time. This will be an ordinance that you can take to your city or county to say, here's what you can do to comply with the state law and to create a pathway forward for access in the community and, frankly, let's face it, tax revenue, because that's what cities and counties are looking for in these regulations. And so we're going to have those tools for activists. Now, ASA, it cannot go to all 585 cities and all 58 counties in California and do that work. It will fall to local organizing, but to the extent we can support you in that effort, we are absolutely committed to doing that, because you know, this battle for medical cannabis in California, it went local in 2003. We got as much as we could with the Medical Marijuana Program Act with SB 420. The battle then went to the cities and counties to get licensed wherever you could. We've come as far as we can, I think, with that process. And now we've gone to the state legislature to get licensing, and now the battle lines shift back to the cities and counties. And we're going to have to do that work. And I know that won't work for everybody. And it's a bitter pill to swallow that there are places, I think, I don't want to jinx it, but let's say places like Riverside, that are not going to move quickly or maybe not ever towards state regulations. And yet I'm encouraged, even in a place like Riverside, to see a handful of cities like Palm Springs and Desert Hot Springs moving forward with regulations, even in that bastion of conservatism in the state of California. Someone else asked earlier what the most important thing in cleanup legislation is, and I think it's going to deal with local control or local preemption. We're going to have to deal with that, and I think that we're going to have to do some cleanup legislation that deals with this complicated licensing scheme to make it more accessible, and part of that may have to deal with trying to issue licenses and seeing what works, and so that might be a longer process. Okay, I see one more question here, and if you have another question, put it up right away because we're over time and I don't want to keep you too long. This question says, how can we stay involved? I love that question. Other than to donate with ASA going forward as more guidelines are put in. I would say, first of all, if you are not on our email discussion list, you need to be on it. Most of the conversation that we're having about regulations, that is informed, rational conversation, is happening on the California Campaign for Safe Access email list. You'll find a link to that on our blog, on our website. I'll even put one in the comments of this once we wrap up here. Because that's where you're going to hear the latest breaking news, and we're going to need people involved in the rulemaking process, because while the rulemaking process is not strictly speaking political, the needs of real people are going to carry a lot of weight when we're talking to regulators about testing standards and pesticides and environmental impacts of cannabis, which are now regulated. They're going to need to hear from individual patients and people affected by the choices they make, and so that's one way to do it. I also think that a really important way to stay involved is, of course, to participate in our lobby day. You know, I didn't mention this at the beginning, but we've had 4 lobby days now in California. We'll be doing it again next year, and I've seen an absolute 180 in the way that we're perceived in Sacramento since we've been bringing constituents. You know, research shows that an undecided lawmaker is 6 times more likely to be influenced by a visit from a constituent than they are by a visit from a paid lobbyist. And so participating in that lobby day, if you can't get to Sacramento, do it in your district offices, get on the phone, email, make phone calls, write letters, because it all really adds up. And the reason we were able to achieve so much this year and gain so many concessions and stop some bad proposals is because lawmakers knew that advocates in Sacramento, me and others, were speaking for real patients in their district, and that makes a huge, huge difference. I also want to say, just because it is part of my mission in life, that somebody says, it says in parentheses here, how can we stay involved? And then in parentheses, other than donate with ASA. And I want to really point out that if you're not an ASA member, that is a really important way to stay involved, because the nuts and bolts of this organization in California and in Washington, D.C., where really exciting stuff is happening, it's paid for by people like you. We have 50,000 active members in this organization nationwide. Most of them are in California, and your $25, $35, $50, $100 annual membership contribution, your monthly contribution that you make, people make $5, $10, $15, $20 monthly contributions. That pays for the work we're doing. That keeps the lights on, it keeps the phones connected, it keeps the web page up. So donating is very important. I don't want anyone to think it isn't. So I don't see another question rolling up on the screen. I'm going to start to wrap up. If you're typing, type fast, because we're going to log off. I want to thank everyone for their participation, and I want to say also thank you to Talana, who's in Washington, D.C. She's staying up really late for us tonight. Thank you, Talana, for making this all work with the Google Hangout. We're going to be doing this again as we move forward. We're going to have probably another live Google Hangout in a couple of months. We'll announce the date later. I also want to remind you that registration is open for Unity 16, our 2016 National Medical Cannabis Unity Conference in Washington, D.C. If you book now, your registration is less expensive, your flight's less expensive, your hotel's less expensive. You go and get a room at the Lowe's Madison, because I promise you'll have a lot more fun if you stay at the conference hotel. So go on our webpage, check out the National Medical Cannabis Unity Conference.org and get registered for that, because one of the really exciting things in California is that we're regulating, but we're doing it in a national context where medical cannabis is closer than ever before to being legal. There's a bill right now in both houses of Congress, and I would love to have hundreds of people from California talking to our senator, Senator Feinstein in particular, and saying, hey, move that bill out of your committee. She sits on the Judiciary Committee, and she needs to see hundreds of us in the office building there in DC saying, hey, it's time to move this bill and you can do in Washington, D.C. what California finally managed to do this year. And so getting to that conference is going to be very, very important. So let me put in a plug for that. And now I see no more questions have rolled up on the screen. So I think we may be wrapping up tonight. My apologies again for the technical issues. This will be archived, and if it's possible, we'll cut out that little segment of 5 or 10 minutes where there's a blank spot. But thank you for your patience. Thank you for participation. Join ASA. Keep talking online about these bills and what comes next. And come see us in Washington, D.C. in March of 2016 to be a part of medical cannabis history in Washington, D.C. So thanks a lot tonight. Thank you for staying up late, and I will look forward to talking to you next time. Good night.